sure, surely there's a way we can provide the support in a way that like treats our employees like adults who can manage their own lives. I'm Keaton Fletcher, an assistant professor of industrial organizational psychology at Colorado State University.
And I'm Mariana Arvon, an organizational psychologist who specializes in organization and talent development.
And this is Healthy Work. All right, and welcome back to another episode of Healthy Work. I will get out of the way and let our amazing guests introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Katrina Brownell. I am an assistant professor of management at Virginia Tech. I study why people do bad things at work and bad things that happen to people at work, I think is the simplest way to explain it.
That's amazing. I love the simple explanations. And I have you here for, I think, just a really powerful and impactful paper that you recently published. And I was hoping that you could explain it to our listeners.
Sure. So this paper kind of came out of my own experiences with reproductive loss. I experienced losses while I was a doctoral student and then while in a faculty job at a university. And so kind of realizing that workplaces don't have a lot of meaningful language or structure or things like that for recognizing these experiences. And this has started to change over the last decade or so. There's been a big body of work in the organizational behavior literature that looks at how organizations are starting to recognize like the maternity experience, like people who become pregnant, have children, things like that. But reproductive loss is a really unique kind of experience. And so the idea behind this study was to kind of look at, what is the individual like identity work that happens when this transition towards a maternal identity begins and then is like abruptly destroyed by some sort of loss and exists in a context where organizations, for a lot of good reasons, don't really have language around it yet. And so silence is sort of the default.
I think that's so interesting from so many different perspectives. I want to try to like dive in order. I guess first and foremost, just from like a methodology perspective, because this is, an autoethnography is not something that I think I typically come across in my reading. And so what does that look like from the researcher side?
It's interesting. So this is actually the first autoethnography I've done. I've read several really powerful autoethnographies by other scholars, and it's always been something that there's just a really interesting tension. A lot of times when we talk about doing research, we sort of want to have analytical distance from the data. But the point of autoethnography, or at least what I see in other scholars, is that, using our own experiences gives us access to data in a way that is hard or sometimes maybe even impossible to access through traditional methods, whether that's, surveys or interviews or archival data, that kind of thing. So autoethnography is really just about finding a way to take your lived experiences and then kind of whatever, data that you want to collect around an experience and then trying to sort of step back and analyze it the way you would, a traditional paper. And for this paper, it's interesting actually, because I started out just using text as the analysis. And then one of the reviewers in the review process really pushed me a little bit in a way that I think was great towards, what other artifacts are there? What other data is there? And another paper had come out, I think in Journal of Management Studies, that was looking at using, visual artifacts as data and things like that. And so I was very much inspired by that to kind of bring in some visual artifacts and sort of the experiences and text that went along with them. So again, this is my first autoethnography, so I don't want to claim to be an expert in it or anything like that. But I just found it really, really interesting in this context, of course. Also a lot of painful experiences kind of in going back through this and remembering, how I was feeling and what I was experiencing around, the specific points in time. It was mostly journal entries and then a blog that I ran for several years. But just a really interesting way of sort of trying to say, like, this was my experience. How can I use it, but also get distance from it in a way that maybe, mirrors or helps other people who are experiencing the same thing?
There's so much that I think is really cool about this, like from the science side, stepping back of just really opening up, I think, what students or people can think about what science looks like when we think about managerial science or organizational behavior or psychology. Like you said, mostly I think about surveys or I think about experiments and I think about large samples or, occasionally we see qualitative studies sneak in there every once in a while or mixed method. And I really appreciate the idea of taking, that scientific perspective to a different data set, to a different way of thinking. I think that opens up our understanding and adds some really needed color. And I like to think that it also opens up the field to a wider variety of people, who want to be able to bring that perspective. And so just like, I really appreciate you taking that step because, like I said, I'm not sure of how many other OB scholars have been doing autoethnographies. And I just think that it's something I'd love to see more of and see, people outside of our field view it as accessible and view it as a way to approach science in a meaningful and really cool way. And then I also, it sounds like from a personal perspective that like as a scientist, being able to bring that perspective to your own experience is in some ways like helpful. And I can imagine that like trying to bring the way of thinking about science to my own personal experiences as like a way of making it through and sense making my own lived experience. I haven't I haven't written a paper from it, but I think that that's a tool I'm going to try to keep in my back pocket moving forward. Moving into like what you found having done this study, what I really resonated with in your initial description and having read it is like this idea of identity transition sort of being like slam shut in the middle of that transition process, and thinking about broader role theory or identity management theory, where like we have these roles, we have these identities, we go through challenging and effortful transitions from one role to the next, and how that is a process. And I think that alone, when I first came across like reading that back in graduate school, had like a light bulb moment of like, oh my gosh, this is a stressful experience to try to put on a different hat, to try to view yourself differently or take on a new role. But reading your paper and hearing you talk about the idea of like being in the middle of that transition process and then having that door slam shut, there's no roadmap, and that sounds so much more challenging. And so I'd just love to hear a little bit more about what did you find? What are some like main takeaways about what to do when that happens?
I think that, we tend to think about identity transitions in like a pretty stable way. Like as soon as you start an identity transition, you're sort of on this trajectory. And we have tons of great research about like what happens during that trajectory. How does it usually go? There's some great papers that look at, the IVF process and fertility and like what happens when that transition is stalled or delayed or things like that. But I think the idea of it, slamming shut, to use your word and mine as well, it's a really, really different, because we don't often have a lot of identity-based transitions that are sort of abruptly terminated in that way. And so I think, or what I was trying to understand in the paper is, when we talk about cross-domain identity work, we're sort of saying, something happens at work and it bleeds over into who I am at home, or something happens at home and it bleeds over into who I am at work. And this is sort of trying to understand, well, like what happens when it can't bleed over, or when organizations don't really have, the policies or the support to recognize that it is in fact bleeding over.
That makes a lot of sense. And I just am curious then, from a practical perspective, if you want to take a couple of steps away or further, I want to give you the liberty to do that. Of what would you recommend then? Like, what are policies that we're looking for? What are ways that managers or coworkers could support people through, either this specific experience or maybe just broadly the idea of those similar? I think IVF is another good example. Identity transitions that then get stymied.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the big lessons is that acknowledgement and recognition are hugely important, even in situations where people might not want to disclose like details or have long conversations. And so I think what happens is, managers, organizations sometimes misunderstand employee silence, where they say, okay, if someone isn't talking about something, then maybe they don't want it to be recognized. Maybe they don't want it to be talked about. Maybe they don't want it to be acknowledged. But those are actually really very different things. And people who are experiencing this type of loss, like they might not know how to explain what they're feeling. They might want privacy, or they might want the ability to say, something happened. I don't want to talk about it, but, I need support or I need leave and things like that. And I think that was one of the hardest things that I felt that I navigated, because as soon as you explain or share to someone this is happening, like it opens the door for like an emotional reaction from that person. And they, immediately say all the right things, right? I'm so sorry. And can I give you a hug and all these kinds of things. And I think sometimes people don't want that. So they stay silent, but then that sort of is taking away the like logistical support that they might need. And so what is the bigger policy implication? Maybe it's something different for organizations about how they're thinking about leave policies or managerial training or flexibility, or how can we put policies and practices in place in a way that allows people to say, something happened, I need some personal days, without having to go into explaining, here's everything that just happened to me. And I don't know that I have a great answer for this, but I think that there's a gray area between recognition and silence and acknowledgement and actually like having to explain what happened. So, but I think it really is that there's a misunderstanding from an organizational side about silence, where they say, well, this person's not talking about it, or this person hasn't shared anything, or I don't even know that anything happened, so they probably don't need any support, or they probably don't need leave, or a very benevolent approach is they probably want privacy. They probably want to keep the experience themselves, but that absence of recognition can kind of add to the feeling of isolation, the grief, the stress of trying to navigate that at home.
That makes so much sense of, that moment of, do I, from the employee side, do I disclose or do I not disclose? How do I manage not getting the reaction that I want? Whether that is I want support, but I also don't know if like this is a comfortable environment to ask for support, or I have support and I don't like want the emotional reaction right now because I'm already like navigating that for myself, but I still need support. How do I approach getting that support without getting that emotional reaction? But then on the flip side, the employer's perspective of how do we provide support without prying? And I think something that you hit on that like I've been mulling over in broader context of just like almost the adversarial relationship between employers and employees, where I've oftentimes like, especially if employers like require documentation about like why you were sick or things along those lines, it's like, do you not trust your employees to be adults, right? And like
Right.
we know our employees are like trying to get one over on us and we don't want the wool pulled over our eyes. So we are going to require excessive documentation for everything. And, I the phenomenon of not wanting to be duped, is widely documented at the individual level, but certainly I'd imagine also at the organizational level. But like, can we not? Sure, surely
Right.
there's a way we can provide the support in a way that like treats our employees like adults who can manage their own lives, but in a way that also doesn't isolate them and force that, your struggles into the closet almost.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think that is the concern, is that if we have policies, that then we'll say like, oh, well, somewhere down the line, someone might abuse this policy. And I think the counter argument that's very popular is the people that are benefiting are probably going to outweigh the person that is going to abuse this policy. And so hopefully I can wander off a little bit. Another area of research that I do is workplace sexual violence. And I study it in higher education. And there's like a very similar sort of feeling here that, if we offer support, if we believe survivors, then every once in a while, someone might come along who is exaggerating their experience. And like, yes, that harms everyone, right? When that happens, but it's so rare. And we have so much research at this point that says, survivors of sexual violence don't lie. And, I haven't done the research on people who experience reproductive loss, but I think that it's probably equally rare that survivors of reproductive loss or people who have not experienced loss are going to lie about it to get a day off of work, right? Like it seems ridiculous when you say it out loud like that, and it's just sort of the same sort of dynamic where we're so worried about being duped that we're, to use your very good words, that we're not offering the support to all the people who genuinely do need it, whose needs probably outweigh the harm done to an organization by a person who maybe takes advantage of that policy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking about, the very unique approach to research that an autoethnography is, I'm curious, like, did anything surprise you in writing this paper, maybe in going through the process? Did themes or ideas come out that, you were surprised by?
Actually, yes. I think so it's really hard to study silence, right? It's hard to study things that aren't there. Like you can't give someone a survey and ask them 20 questions about something that didn't happen in a really effective way. And so I think it was sort of going through the data and realizing that organizational silence is actually like a really active force in shaping the experience of reproductive loss. And I think it's because we sort of think of silence as neutral, and it's kind of what we were just talking about. If I don't say anything, if I don't recognize it, well, it's probably because this person doesn't want to talk about it. It's like a very sort of neutral feeling from an organizational perspective. But like we just talked about, silence can force people into really extraordinary forms of emotional and cognitive labor. People who experience loss become really hyper aware of how they move through the workplace, right? They want to, minimize like physical signs of distress, things like that. And all of that is labor, right? It's cognitive labor that they're experiencing. And so I think it was surprising to kind of go through the data and reflect on these experiences and actually recognize that like organizational silence, like it actually, it creates like almost a physical feeling of like, I don't want to say anger, but maybe like a frustration that these things aren't being recognized, that silence is kind of forcing individuals to carry this like life altering experience into a professional environment that just sort of carries on like nothing has happened. And then sort of digging into that, and this is again where the reviewers and the editor and the review process were really helpful, was sort of realizing that silence, like while I think it is suppressive and it can bring up a lot of like emotional labor, it also kind of sort of creates these opportunities for people to sort of create like, well, here's how I'm going to share what happened to me because I think it's important to do so, right? And if the organization had not been silent, then maybe that like alternative path of sharing the story would not necessarily have emerged. And so I think really the surprising thing was just realizing that silence was not just silence, but it was like playing a really active role in the identity work that was going on that followed loss.
What that makes me think of is just like broadly like more taboo topics, which it's wild that like reproductive loss is a taboo topic, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like 1 in 4 pregnancies, something like that, ends in reproductive loss. And I know that like anything that even closely resembles like reproduction is something that the workplace has feelings about.
Yeah.
And the silence compounded with that, to me, it sounds like it would be one of those pieces that could like really give it that additional dark flavor of you're already dealing with something that is stigmatized in some capacity, or is at the very least taboo within an organizational setting. But also, I think culturally, we don't really talk about reproductive loss. We don't really talk about a lot of reproductive health issues, but certainly reproductive loss. And then being, forced to also not talk about it, whether that's cultural norms in the organization or lack of support, I think that would have to compound that. And the other thing that you brought up that makes me think of something I was recently talking about, one of our recent guests, Dave Arena, was talking about how in response to like a hostile environment, they found that LGBT employees who were like testing the waters and signaling their identity either like followed one of two paths of just like shutting down and not being authentic at all and hiding their identity, or being like the courageously like fully authentic selves. And my interpretation, the data, I don't think we're there to say this necessarily, but like I would expect it was, almost that similar perspective of like, well, I'm going to find a way to be my authentic self and live my experience in the face of this hostility, or in this case, in the face of the silence. And I just, the human spirit of finding a way, not everyone and not all the time, but finding a way to, I don't know, speak your truth and be your authentic self and find meaning in these really dark and challenging moments, is really impressive.
It's interesting because I do think that there's a lot of cultural stigma around reproductive loss, and something that I didn't touch on in this particular paper, but I think that recognizing that abortion is a form of reproductive loss, and like, boy, is that like a complicated cultural stigma, right? Where it's like, let's say that someone decides, as they have their own right and decision to decide that they need to terminate a pregnancy. Like, we have no cultural scripts for that. And so I think, expecting that an organization would have a cultural script for that is like very against kind of what is going on across the country. But I think that in particular is probably a really difficult form of loss to navigate with silence. And I think that sort of the specific stigma around that type of loss probably adds like a very complex layer onto, the identity work that an individual is experiencing. And maybe not always, but sometimes. I also think that the time at which the loss occurs adds a very complex layer. Some non-small statistic of reproductive loss occurs in the first trimester. And so often in the first trimester, by the time you get to the end, the pregnant person may or may not be showing, may or may not be sharing, things like that. But loss that occurs much later in the second trimester is sort of recognized a little bit differently. It's more often recognized, I think, as a loss than an early first trimester loss. And that also, I feel like, adds a lot of really complex layers, why do we recognize the loss just because someone's had an extra, 4 or 5 weeks of being pregnant, that kind of thing? Or why do we recognize the loss if a pregnant person experiences a stillbirth or neonatal death, which is death within, I think, 1 or 2 weeks, within being born. And so there's so many different layers and brands and kinds of loss. And I feel like silence is probably different. And the experience of silence is probably different across all of those.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I mean, when my partner was pregnant, there's sort of like the rule of like, well, don't tell anyone until you're 12 weeks because you don't know if you'll make it past 12 weeks, which we bucked that and we were like, we will tell people. But like, even the fact that like that's just a cultural baked in of like, well, you don't want other people to know in case like you don't get to term, right? Like then does it make the loss any less real for us if that's to happen, right? Like what then I've like baked out like any support that I could have gotten. I don't know. Yeah, the idea of timing about when that occurs is not something that I had thought about until just now. But like, of course, that's going to come into it and really matter. And I think that's really interesting. My big last question to you is just generally, why do you do the work that you do? I mean, this paper or more broadly?
Part of it, I think, is because I'm just massively extroverted. And I really like the idea of calling attention to things that aren't really talked about or aren't really recognized. Before I was in academia, I had, a couple of careers. I came into academia in my late 30s, early 40s. And so that's sort of, I think, a little bit freeing in terms of research topic and focus and things like that. When I've been doing, because I do a handful of research that is probably similarly stigmatized. And it's interesting because I've had people say like, ooh, I wouldn't do that, or don't touch that until after you have tenure, like that kind of thing. And I sort of feel like, no, like if, I mean, like, sorry, tenure PNT committee, don't listen to this, please. But like, I kind of feel like if we have the tools and the desire and the motivation to sort of shine a light on these sorts of things in a way that might help one person who's navigating it or help us better understand how we can support people that navigate it, then it's kind of like, well, why not? Like, why wouldn't I? The flip side of that is, of course, this work is really hard. This paper and the work that I do with survivors, like it can be really heavy and traumatizing. It's not the same as trying to understand like, oh, like another mediator that improves job performance, and that's valuable work too. Like, I'm not trying to poo-poo that kind of work, but it can be really, really heavy. But I feel like that makes it actually more important to do. And I guess the last thing I'll say is that, since this paper has come out, the response has been tremendous and overwhelming. And I feel very like almost a little like, ooh, I didn't really realize that was going to happen. But I've heard from so many people who have had this experience and say, I had this experience of reproductive loss at work and no one said anything and no one did anything. I have a very good friend that was a PhD student. We overlapped a little bit and she got pregnant while she was in her PhD and she felt like she had to actively hide her entire pregnancy from her advisor because of all the stigma just around maternity in general. Like, she didn't experience a loss. And I remember her telling me these stories about wearing like gigantic coats and then one day being like, oh, look what I found in my uterus last week. It's a baby, like these like crazy things that we do to try and hide our experiences. And so I sort of feel, especially after kind of hearing the responses, like, I don't know, I mean, everyone's research is just a tiny brick in the wall, right? But if I can put a tiny brick in the wall that maybe helps like one person feel heard or helps one manager help one person a little bit more, then that to me is enough. There's this quote that I really like that is like, what can I do today to make this mountain taller so the people that come behind me can see further, right? And so that's just kind of the idea. Like, what's the tiny brick that I can put down that then someone can come after me and put another brick down, and then someone else puts another one. And then a long time from now, things have maybe started to shift and change a little bit.
I love that. And I think that is an outstanding place to leave it. Thank you so much for the work that you do and for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was awesome.
Bye. Healthy Work is a podcast written and executive produced by Keaton Fletcher and Mariana Arvon. This episode is produced, mixed, and edited by Keaton Fletcher. Artwork is by Keaton Fletcher. And our music is Zero, Microsong by Steve Combs. Please like us, follow us, and subscribe on whatever podcasting software you use. And please leave a review on the iTunes Store. It really does help get us out there.